Welcome to Karen's HOA Nightmares. Get ready for the most outrageous, shocking, and downright hilarious tales from the world of homeowners associations. In today's story, Michael Kendrick, a skilled architect, is blindsided when Vixen, Utah, the local HOA president, storms into his lakefront cabin office with a hidden agenda. What begins as a friendly visit quickly turns into a battle for his family's legacy, as Vixen uses her power to try to force him out for a real estate deal. As her harassment escalates, Michael uncovers a sinister plot involving corrupt developers and water rights, and with the help of Governor Lana Rhodes, he fights back. Vixen's overconfidence leads to her downfall, exposing her criminal network and restoring justice for Michael and his community. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest hot stories. You're finished. My heart nearly stopped when I heard that voice thunder through my cabin office. One moment, I was quietly working at my drafting table, and the next, this woman, Vixen, Utah, was bursting through the door like a madwoman. No knock, no warning, just invading my space. She stormed in with actual sheriff deputies, shouting about shutting down my illegal operation. I sat there, completely stunned, coffee spilling everywhere, watching this woman tear my morning apart like a tornado. But the moment her eyes locked onto the person sitting across from my desk, she froze. I saw it instantly. She had made a monumental mistake. Before I get into what happened next, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because what's about to unfold will completely blow your mind. You know how sometimes someone shows up with cookies and a smile so perfect it feels off? Well, that's exactly what happened on that Tuesday morning when Vixen, Utah first came to my lakefront office. It was like she was auditioning for a role in a wholesome commercial, standing there in a perfectly pressed suit, holding a plate of chocolate chip cookies with a smile that screamed danger, even if my brain was trying to be polite. "Hello," she said with a sweetness that felt off. "I'm Vixen Blackwood, your HOA president and chairwoman of the welcoming committee." The way she said "your" made it sound like she owned me, and everything else in the community. I should have trusted my instincts right there, but who would suspect a woman bearing freshly baked cookies? I invited her in. After all, that's what neighbors do when someone brings cookies, right? Wrong. The moment she stepped into my cabin office, her friendly mask started to slip. Instead of admiring my grandfather's handcrafted cedar walls or the lake view that made my cabin special, she was scanning the room, cataloging every piece of expensive equipment in sight. My top-of-the-line computer setup, my drafting tables, my professional meeting space. She was eyeing it all. I could almost hear the dollar signs forming in her mind. "Well, this looks like a commercial operation," she said, her voice shifting into a tone of fake concern, one that sounded as genuine as a counterfeit bill. "This could be an issue from a community standards standpoint." That's when the mask fully came off, and I realized I wasn't talking to a neighbor anymore. I was dealing with a woman on a mission. "I've been the HOA president for 4 years, and I need to discuss some compliance issues regarding home-based businesses in lakefront properties," she continued, pulling a clipboard out of nowhere. Wait, 5 minutes ago she was all about cookies and welcoming committees, and now she's here to enforce some so-called compliance regulations? It felt like a setup, and I was trying to figure out how we'd gone from cookies to compliance violations in the blink of an eye. She started snapping pictures of my office setup, and when I asked why, she gave me some canned response about showcasing local home businesses in a community publication. Yeah, right, then the not-so-subtle threats started coming. "Several lakefront properties have had to adjust their commercial operations to meet neighborhood standards," she said, tapping her pen like it was a weapon. The way she said adjust made my blood run cold. It wasn't advice, it was a warning. She asked all sorts of questions about my business, how many clients I see per week, what projects I work on, and whether I'd considered developing this prime location for its highest use. That last question made it clear. This wasn't about HOA standards. This was about her digging for information about my income, client base, and my attachment to the property that had been in my family for 3 generations. As she continued, I noticed little details that didn't add up. Her manicure was too expensive for someone volunteering for HOA work. Her shoes were worth more than most people's rent. And that clipboard? It wasn't from a basic office supply store. It was a luxury item, leather with gold corners. This woman wasn't just a local HOA president. She was playing a game, and I was her next target. "Don't worry, we'll figure this out neighborly-like," she said as she gathered her things to leave. But her tone told a different story. This was just the calm before a storm. As she made her way to the door, Vixen dropped something from her folder. It was a business card from Lakeside Development Partners, and it landed face up right in front of me, like some cosmic joke. When I bent down to pick it up, she snatched it away so quickly you'd think it was on fire. "Oh, that's nothing," she said, but her voice had an unmistakable edge. Too late, lady, I thought. I had already seen enough to know this wasn't about community standards. It was about development, and my property was standing in the way of someone's payday. After Vixen left, I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The cookies sat untouched on my counter. I walked over to where she had been standing, and that's when I noticed something else she'd left behind. Her notepad. I picked it up, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There it was, in her neat handwriting. A detailed sketch of my property layout, notes on my office equipment, parking patterns, and at the bottom of the page, commercial violation for sale. But there was something else under that, something that made my blood run cold. The last line was a phone number and the name Marcus Pinnacle, with a note about a $500K commission upon successful acquisition. $500,000. That's how much Vixen was going to make off selling my family's legacy. Not the property itself, but her cut for stealing it from me. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to process the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't just an HOA president flexing her power. Vixen, Utah was running a real estate scam, and I was her next target. But the worst part? Those cookies were actually pretty good, and somehow that made the whole thing sting even more. My refusal to sell wasn't just costing her a commission. It was threatening to derail a multi-year investment strategy that involved dozens of properties and multiple layers of corruption throughout the county government. No wonder she'd escalated to bringing in building inspectors with pre-written violation reports. The woman was fighting for more money than most people see in a lifetime. That's when Vixen decided to bring in the big guns, literally. Tuesday morning of week 5, I opened my door to find a building inspector flanked by 2 county officials, all carrying clipboards and wearing expressions that suggested they had already made up their minds about what they were going to find. The inspector introduced himself as Thomas Rivera, and he had this official letter authorizing him to conduct an immediate safety inspection of my commercial operation. And the letter cited electrical hazards, structural concerns, and environmental problems that posed imminent danger to the surrounding community. It was all very official, very intimidating, and very obviously predetermined. Rivera spent 3 hours going through my cabin with a fine-tooth comb, taking photographs, making notes, and finding violations that would have made a building code encyclopedia blush. Exposed electrical junction boxes that were actually legitimate architectural features. Structural modifications that were actually original design elements from 1947. Environmental hazards that were actually native plants growing naturally around the foundation. When Rivera finished his inspection, he presented me with a violation report that read like a horror story. $15,000 in required repairs for problems that didn't exist, all due within 30 days, or face immediate closure of my business operations. The violations were detailed, technical, and completely fabricated, but they were also legally binding unless I could prove they were false, which would require hiring my own structural engineer, electrical contractor, and environmental consultant at a cost that would probably exceed the repair estimates. It was a beautiful trap. Spend $15,000 fixing fake problems, or spend $20,000 proving the problems were fake, or lose my business entirely. Rivera handed me the report with this apologetic shrug that suggested he was just doing his job. But I caught him glancing toward the road where a familiar figure was sitting in a black luxury sedan, watching the whole performance through binoculars. The community pressure campaign reached its peak that week when half my neighbors started believing Vixen's propaganda about property values and traffic concerns. The other half were growing suspicious of her aggressive tactics, but fear of retaliation kept most of them quiet. I found myself caught in the middle of a neighborhood Cold War with property owners choosing sides based on their own vulnerabilities to HOA pressure. The retired couple next door stopped waving when I checked my mail. The young family across the street installed security cameras pointed toward my driveway. But the woman 2 houses down started making a point of walking her dog past my office every morning, nodding supportively like she was trying to send me a message without saying anything out loud. It was psychological warfare disguised as community governance, and it was working exactly as Vixen had planned. That's when I realized I needed a powerful ally to fight this level of professional corruption. And I remembered Governor Lana Rhodes from my work on the State Veterans Center project 2 years earlier. Lana had been genuinely impressed with my design work, especially how I'd incorporated accessibility features without compromising the building's aesthetic appeal. We'd developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect, and she'd mentioned more than once that she'd like to work with me again on future state projects. Calling the governor's office felt like a desperate move, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I contacted her office about a new state community center proposal, a legitimate project I'd been developing that could serve rural communities throughout the region. It was the perfect professional cover for what I really needed. Someone with enough authority to investigate the corruption that was destroying my life. Governor Rhodes remembered me immediately and was genuinely interested in reviewing my community center designs. We scheduled a project consultation for Friday morning at my office, which would give us the perfect opportunity to discuss both the legitimate state project and the corruption I'd uncovered. Lana was already aware of development corruption issues in rural counties. Apparently my situation wasn't unique, just particularly well organized. She agreed to coordinate with state investigators, who were building a broader case against corrupt networks in county government. The meeting would serve multiple purposes, advancing a real architectural project, gathering evidence for ongoing investigations, and sending a clear message to anyone monitoring my communications that I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Of course, Vixen's surveillance network picked up on my phone call with the governor's office, but she completely misinterpreted what she was hearing. Her informants reported that I'd contacted state government about consultation services, which she assumed meant I was hiring some expensive government lawyer as a last-ditch legal defense. In her mind, this was proof that her pressure campaign was working. I was getting desperate enough to throw money at high-prick legal representation. She had no idea that the state consultation was actually a legitimate business meeting with someone who had the authority to investigate her entire operation. Her overconfidence was about to become her biggest vulnerability, but she was too focused on her pending victory to recognize the danger signs. By Thursday evening, Vixen was practically glowing with anticipated triumph. She'd positioned this as the final battle between community standards and outside interference between legitimate HOA authority and expensive lawyers trying to intimidate honest neighbors. She spent the evening calling her network, coordinating what she described as a community response to my Friday morning meeting with the government lawyer. She wanted witnesses, she wanted documentation, and she wanted to make sure everyone in the neighborhood saw her demonstrate what real community authority looked like when it was properly exercised. Little did she know she was about to learn the difference between fake authority and real power, and the lesson was going to be very, very expensive. Vixen overhears Michael's meeting plans and decides this is perfect timing to destroy Michael and his fancy ally. But as she's planning her attack, she receives a phone call that makes her smile in a way that would terrify anyone who saw it. Who called her? And why does she suddenly seem so confident about Friday morning? The phone call that made Vixen smile like a predator was from Marcus Pinnacle himself, the developer who had been pulling strings behind this entire operation. I found out about this call later, but apparently Marcus had been monitoring my government lawyer situation through his own contacts and county administration. He was thrilled that I was finally showing signs of desperation, convinced that expensive legal representation meant I was preparing to negotiate a settlement rather than continue fighting their harassment campaign. "This is perfect timing, Vixen," he told her over the phone. "Let them think they're bringing in the big guns, then crush them both publicly. Show the community and this fancy lawyer exactly who runs things around here. Make it spectacular." That conversation was the final nail in Vixen's coffin, though she didn't realize it at the time. Marcus had just encouraged her to commit the biggest mistake of her criminal career. Vixen spent Thursday night orchestrating what she envisioned as her masterpiece demonstration of HOA authority. She contacted Building Inspector Rivera, demanding he be present for the final enforcement action against my illegal commercial operation. She called Deputy Sheriff Derek Walsh, convincing him that I was planning to resist legitimate government orders with help from my expensive legal team. She even recruited several HOA board members and concerned neighbors to serve as witnesses to her triumph over outside interference. In Vixen's mind, this was going to be the perfect public relations victory. Law-abiding community members standing up to wealthy developers and their corrupt lawyers. The irony was absolutely delicious considering she was the one working for wealthy developers and running the corruption scheme. But that's what happens when criminals start believing their own cover stories. Friday morning arrived with that perfect autumn weather that makes lakefront property so desirable. Clear skies, gentle breeze leaves just starting to turn colors. I was up early cleaning my office and preparing presentation materials for Governor Rhodes's 7 a.m. arrival. I'll admit I was nervous. Not because I doubted Lana's ability to handle the situation, but because I knew Vixen was planning something spectacular, and I had no idea how ugly things might get before they got better. Lana arrived exactly on time, driving an unmarked government vehicle that looked expensive, but not ostentatious. She was dressed in professional business attire that subtly conveyed authority without screaming, "Important government official." Perfect camouflage for what was about to unfold. Our meeting started as a completely legitimate business consultation about the community center project. Lana reviewed my architectural plans with genuine interest, asking detailed questions about accessibility features, construction costs, and timeline considerations. We discussed funding sources, site selection criteria, and the approval process for state construction projects. It was exactly the kind of professional conversation that made me remember why I'd enjoyed working with her administration before. Lana had this way of combining policy expertise with practical understanding that made complex government projects actually achievable. For about 45 minutes, I almost forgot about Vixen and her harassment campaign. We were just two professionals discussing ways to serve rural communities through better public architecture. That's when we heard the vehicles pulling into my driveway. Multiple cars with doors slamming and voices raised in official-sounding conversation. Lana glanced toward the window and smiled knowingly. "I believe your visitors have arrived," she said calmly. "Are you ready for this?" I nodded, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest cavity. Lana positioned herself at my drafting table, where she'd been reviewing the architectural plans, spreading the official state documents in clear view. She looked completely natural, sitting there in her business suit, surrounded by government paperwork and professional materials. To anyone walking in, she would appear to be exactly what Vixen expected, an expensive consultant reviewing legal documents at a client meeting. Through my office windows, I could see Vixen's assault force assembling on my front lawn, like some kind of bureaucratic SWAT team. Rivera, the building inspector, was there with his clipboard and official stamps. Deputy Walsh had arrived in his patrol car, looking uncomfortable, but determined to do his duty. Several neighbors were gathering at a respectful distance, clearly expecting some kind of confrontation, but unsure what they were supposed to witness. And there was Vixen herself, dressed in her most authoritative business outfit, carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained every piece of fake documentation she'd assembled over the past month. She looked like a general preparing for her final victorious battle, confident that an overwhelming official presence would intimidate both me and my expensive lawyer into submission. What Vixen couldn't see from outside was that her expensive lawyer was actually reviewing legitimate state business documents at an official government meeting. Lana had positioned herself perfectly to appear exactly as threatening as Vixen expected, while actually conducting completely legal state business. The architectural plans spread across my drafting table were real. The government seal on Lana's briefcase was authentic. The official documents scattered around the workspace were genuine state communications about public construction projects. Everything Vixen was about to confront was absolutely, completely, and legally legitimate. The trap was set with perfect precision, baited with Vixen's own assumptions about what she was going to find inside my office. I watched through the window as Vixen gave her final briefing to her assembled enforcement team. She was gesturing toward my office, clearly explaining what they were going to find and how they should respond to resistance from illegal representation. Rivera was nodding seriously, reviewing his violation reports one more time. Deputy Walsh was checking his equipment and protocols for dealing with potentially hostile situations. The neighbors were positioning themselves where they could observe without interfering, ready to witness Vixen's demonstration of community authority over outside interference. Everyone was playing their assigned role in Vixen's carefully choreographed performance, completely unaware that they were about to become supporting actors in their leader public humiliation. Lana remained perfectly calm throughout these preparations, occasionally glancing toward the window, but mostly focusing on the architectural documents. "She's certainly thorough in her planning," she observed quietly. "I can see why this situation has been so stressful for you, but I think you're going to find that some problems solve themselves when the right people get involved." Her confidence was reassuring, but I still felt like I was about to jump out of an airplane without being completely sure my parachute would open. Everything depended on Vixen reacting exactly as we expected, with maximum arrogance and minimum research about who she was actually confronting. As Vixen Shand reached for my office door handle, I heard her voice clearly through the window. Perfect time to show this VIP who really runs this community. But just before she turned the handle, she paused for just a moment, tilting her head like she was trying to hear something from inside that gave her pause. What did she hear that should have been her first warning? What Vixen heard that should have warned her was Governor Rhodes's voice saying, "The state approval process typically takes 90 to 120 days for projects of this scope." But in Vixen's mind, that just confirmed her assumption that I was meeting with some government lawyer discussing legal strategy and timeline expectations. She interpreted official government business terminology as expensive legal consultation, which only increased her confidence about the confrontation she was about to initiate. If she'd been thinking clearly instead of being blinded by overconfidence, she might have wondered why a lawyer would be discussing 90-day approval processes instead of 30-day court deadlines. But criminals who've been successful too long eventually stopped questioning their assumptions, and Vixen had been winning this game for 3 years straight. The door to my office exploded open like something out of an action movie. And Vixen Utah stormed in with the fury of a woman who believed she held all the cards in this particular poker game. "This illegal meeting ends right now," she shouted, her voice carrying enough authority to make paint peel off the walls. She was flanked by Rivera and Deputy Walsh, with several neighbors visible through the doorway behind them, all of them expecting to witness the definitive end of my resistance to community standards. Vixen's entire body language screamed triumph and vindication. Shoulders back, chin raised, finger pointed at me like she was delivering divine judgment. As Hey President, I'm shutting down this lakefront office operation and showing your VIP friend what real community authority looks like. This was her moment of ultimate victory, the culmination of weeks of systematic pressure and bureaucratic warfare. But here's the beautiful thing about overconfidence. It makes people stop paying attention to details that might contradict their assumptions. Vixen was so focused on delivering her dramatic speech about community authority that she didn't immediately process what her eyes were actually seeing. She was looking at a professional woman in an expensive business suit, sitting calmly at my drafting table, surrounded by official documents and government materials. Her brain was expecting to see some nervous private attorneys, scrambling to pack up legal briefings and settlement negotiations. Instead, she was seeing someone who looked completely comfortable in an official government setting reviewing what appeared to be legitimate state business documents. The cognitive dissonance should have been immediate and alarming, but Vixen was too intoxicated by her own performance to notice the warning signs. Whatever you're paying this architect, it won't save his illegal lakefront office from community standards enforcement. Vixen continued marching deeper into my workspace like she owned the place. She was pointing at my equipment, gesturing toward my client meeting area, and generally conducting herself like a conquering general, claiming occupied territory. Rivera and Deputy Walsh followed her, and both of them looking increasingly uncomfortable, as they realized this wasn't quite the scenario Vixen had described to them. They were expecting resistance legal arguments, maybe some heated negotiations between competing authorities. What they found was a quiet business meeting between two professionals discussing architectural plans with no sign of the confrontational legal consultation they'd been prepared to handle. That's when Vixen's eyes finally focused on the woman, sitting at my drafting table, and her brain started processing information instead of just projecting assumptions. The professional woman in expensive suit check that matched her expectations. Official documents spread across the workspace. Check that suggested legal consultation. Government briefcase with authentic-looking seals. Wait, those seals looked very familiar. State letterhead on multiple documents. Hold on. Why would a private attorney have state letterhead? And then the woman stood up and extended her hand with the kind of calm authority that can only come from holding real power instead of just pretending to have it. "Hello, I'm Governor Lana Rhodes. I'm here in Mr. Kendrick's office reviewing state project designs." The freeze that followed was absolutely perfect in its completeness. Vixen's mouth literally hung open mid-sentence, her pointing finger locked in position like she'd been flash-frozen by some kind of bureaucratic ray gun. Her brain was desperately trying to process what she just heard, while Herbity remained locked in the aggressive posture she'd assumed for delivering community justice. Governor, not a lawyer, not a consultant, not some expensive legal representation. The actual governor of the state, the woman who controlled state budgets, appointed department heads, and had the authority to investigate corruption in county government. Vixen's eyes darted between Lana's face and the official state documents scattered across my drafting table, and I could practically see her mental wheels spinning as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. The physical comedy of Vixen's reaction was worth every moment of stress she'd put me through over the past month. Her clipboard crashed to the floor, scattering fake violation reports across my grandfather's hand-built cedar boards. Her perfectly composed HOA president facade cracked like an egg hitting concrete, revealing the panicked expression of someone who had just walked into a trap of her own making. She actually stumbled backward, nearly knocking over Deputy Walsh, who was experiencing his own moment of horrified recognition. Rivera, the building inspector, had gone pale as death, probably calculating how many federal crimes he'd committed in service of Vixen's harassment campaign. The neighbors visible through the doorway were murmuring among themselves, clearly sensing that something had gone very wrong with Vixen's demonstration of community authority. "I'm here reviewing Mr. Kendrick's architectural proposal for our new state community center." Governor Rhodes continued in that calm, professional tone that somehow managed to be more intimidating than shouting. "We're discussing funding requirements, site selection criteria, and the approval timeline for state construction projects. I wasn't aware that HOA had oversight authority over state government business consultations." The way she emphasized state government business made it clear that Vixen had just interrupted an official government meeting, which carried implications that were starting to dawn on everyone present. Rivera was already backing toward the door, probably hoping to disappear before anyone started asking questions about his role in this harassment campaign. Deputy Walsh found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than official law enforcement communication. "Governor Rhodes, I apologize for this interruption. I was told this was a compliance enforcement action regarding zoning violations." The poor guy was clearly realizing he'd been manipulated into participating in something that was looking more criminal by the minute. Lana nodded graciously toward him, acknowledging his apology while maintaining her focus on Vixen, who still hadn't recovered the ability to speak coherently. The power dynamic in my office had shifted so completely that it felt like watching a nature documentary about predators becoming prey in real time. "What's your jurisdiction here, Ms. Blackwood?" Lana asked, her tone remaining professionally curious, while somehow conveying the impression that Vixen's answer might determine whether she faced state or federal charges. "I'm not familiar with any HOA authority over state architectural consultations conducted on private property," and the question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Vixen's head, because everyone present knew she had absolutely no legitimate authority over anything that was happening in my office. Her entire harassment campaign had been based on fabricated violations and abuse of HOA power, and she just exposed herself in front of the one person in the state with enough authority to shut down her entire operation. Governor stands from Michael's office chair. "Miss Blackwood, we need to discuss HOA overreach in private business offices immediately." But there's something in the governor's tone that suggests she knows more about Vixen than she's letting on. How long has the governor been watching? And what exactly does she know? The something in Governor Rhodes's tone that told me she knew way more about Vixen than she was letting on. It was the calm confidence of a hunter who's been tracking her prey for months. As Vixen stood there in my doorway, looking like she'd been hit by a freight train, Lana casually reached into her briefcase and pulled out this thick manila folder that looked like it could choke a horse. "I've been investigating development corruption across 3 counties for 8 months, she said, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Your area was flagged 6 months ago. We've been waiting for you to make exactly this kind of mistake." When that folder hit my drafting table, it sounded like a judge's gavel sealing Vixen's fate. What happened next was like watching someone's entire world collapse in slow motion. And honestly, I was here for every single second of it. Lana opened that folder and started laying out documents like she was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game. Bank records showing payments from Lakeside Development to Vixen's consulting company. Email chains between Vixen and corrupt county officials discussing problem properties that needed to be cleared. Phone recordings where you could literally hear Vixen planning to fabricate violations against innocent homeowners. We have documentation of identical harassment campaigns against 6 other lakefront families. Lana continued spreading photos and legal papers across my workspace. Same pattern every time. Anonymous complaints, fake permit problems, forced sales to Lakeside Development. I looked over at Rivera, the building inspector, and let me tell you, that man had gone from cocky government official to deer in headlights in about 30 seconds flat. He actually tried to make a run for it. Can you believe that? But apparently Lana had positioned state agents outside my office as backup. I heard car doors slamming and official voices saying, "State investigators, you're under arrest," followed by Rivera getting his rights read to him in my own driveway. The guy who had been so confident about his fake inspection reports was now learning what real government authority looked like when it wasn't being used to steal people's homes. The irony was absolutely beautiful. Poor Deputy Walsh was standing in the middle of my office looking like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "She told me this was legitimate HOA business," he practically shouted, and you could hear the panic in his voice. I had no idea this was connected to development deals or corruption. I actually felt bad for the guy. He was just trying to do his job, and Vixen had turned him into an unwitting accomplice in her criminal enterprise. Lana was taking notes while he talked, nodding sympathetically. "We understand you were manipulated, Deputy. Your Kendrickation will be valuable for prosecution." At least someone was getting out of this mess with their integrity intact. The neighbors who'd gathered outside expecting to watch Vixen destroy me were getting the education of their lives about how justice actually works. Through my windows, I could see state agents interviewing people and taking statements. Mrs. Patterson was explaining how Vixen had pressured her into signing petitions against my business. Tom Rodriguez was describing those anonymous phone calls about property values that had everyone scared. One by one, my neighbors were realizing they had been used as weapons against their own community members. The psychological warfare that had turned us against each other was finally being exposed, and people were not happy about being manipulated. Meanwhile, Vixen was watching 3 years of successful crime completely fall apart in real time. The evidence Lana had wasn't just good, it was overwhelming. Phone records prove coordination with corrupt officials. Financial documents showing the shell companies she used to hide her kickbacks from Lakeside. Email conversations where she literally discussed targeting my property because of those water rights, I discovered. But here's the kicker. They also had recordings of Vixen talking about expanding the Operation Toasteel properties all around the lake region, treating families losing their homes like some kind of profitable business opportunity. This woman had turned displacement into a cash cow. And finally, someone with real power was holding her accountable. This is a complete misunderstanding. Vixen finally found her voice. Though she sounded more like a panicked animal than the authoritative HOA president she'd pretended to be, I was protecting community property values. Everything was within HOA guidelines, but even she knew how ridiculous that sounded with all that evidence spread across my table. Lana just looked at her with this expression that could have frozen hell over. "You used fake authority to systematically harass citizens for profit," she said. "We have evidence of conspiracy fraud, civil rights violations, and interference with government operations." When she said federal jurisdiction, I swear Vixen aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The scope of this corruption network was mind-blowing once Lana started explaining it. This wasn't just about my cabin or even those 8 other families Vixen had victimized. She'd inherited her dead husband's entire network of corrupt contacts and turned it into a criminal empire. County inspectors, insurance adjusters, zoning officials, even some local cops. They were all getting paid to participate in forcing people out of their homes so developers could steal prime real estate. The water rights on my land were just one piece of a massive scheme to control resources and development throughout the entire lake region. My stubborn refusal to sell hadn't just cost her a commission. It had threatened to expose millions of dollars in fraudulent deals. By the time those federal agents finished processing, everyone Vixen's whole operation was toast. Rivera and 3 other county officials were arrested for corruption. Insurance company employees faced charges for the harassment campaigns. Even Marcus Pinnacle and his lakeside development cronies were dragged away in handcuffs based on evidence from Vixen's own records. The woman who had spent months making my life miserable was watching her entire criminal kingdom crumble because she'd been too arrogant to do basic research about who she was messing with. Sometimes karma doesn't just catch up with people. Sometimes it runs them over with a federal investigation. Federal agents arrive. "Vixen Blackwood, you're under arrest for federal crimes." But as they're reading her rights, Vixen looks directly at Michael with an expression that's part rage, part disbelief, and part something else entirely. What is she thinking in that moment? And is this really the end of her story? Stories loves to know where you're experiencing this justice unfold from. Drop your location in the comments. The look Vixen gave me as those federal agents slapped handcuffs on her wrists, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was pure rage mixed with complete disbelief. Like she couldn't process how her perfect criminal operation had been destroyed by some simple architect she'd underestimated. But there was something else in her eyes. Grudging respect, maybe? Like she was finally realizing she'd been playing chess with someone who understood the game better than she did. For weeks, she'd been attacking what she thought was an easy target with a small business problem. Turns out, she'd been fighting someone who knew the value of patience documentation and having the right allies when the time came to strike back. The student had become the teacher, and the class was permanently dismissed. The perp walk was everything I dreamed of during those horrible weeks when she was destroying my life piece by piece. Vixen Blackwood, former HOA dictator and professional property thief, was getting marched past every neighbor she'd manipulated, past the cabin she'd tried to steal, past the office where she'd expected to demonstrate her ultimate authority over community affairs. And wouldn't you know it, news cameras had magically appeared because Governor Rhodes's corruption investigation was apparently big enough to attract media attention. They got every humiliating second of the woman who'd positioned herself as defender of community values, being exposed as the criminal who'd been systematically defrauding those same community members. Her expensive business suit and authoritative attitude looked pathetic now, like props from a really bad community theater production about corruption and consequences. The federal charges against Vixen read like a masterclass in white-collar crime. Conspiracy to commit fraud, civil rights violations under color of authority, interference with government operations, money laundering through those shell companies, and racketeering charges that could put her away for 18 to 22 years in federal prison. Every dirty trick she'd used against me and those 8 other families had been documented by Lana's investigation. And every single trick turned out to be a separate federal crime with its own prison sentence. Alto's consulting fees from Lakeside Development gone seized as criminal proceeds. Her house, her cars, every asset she'd bought with blood money from stealing people's homes. All of it was confiscated to pay restitution to her victims. The woman who had threatened to take everything from me was losing everything she'd stolen from others. Lakeside Development Partners went down like the Titanic within a week of the federal raids. Turns out the entire company had been built on fraudulent property acquisitions and corrupt government contracts. Marcus Pinnacle and his executive team faced charges that made Vixen look like a small-time crook. Federal racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, of public officials, fraud involving tens of millions of dollars in illegal development schemes. That luxury resort they were planning to build on my stolen property, never going to happen. Those water rights that motivated this whole nightmare, now protected under state environmental regulations that Governor Rhodes had been working on as part of her anti-corruption initiative. Sometimes the good guys really do win big, and sometimes the bad guys lose absolutely everything they thought they'd gained by cheating honest people. Watching my community heal from Vixen's psychological warfare was almost as satisfying as watching her get arrested. Neighbors who'd been turned against each other by her manipulation finally understood how they'd been used as weapons in her criminal enterprise. Mrs. Patterson came over personally to apologize for signing those petitions against my business, explaining how Vixen had convinced her that my office would destroy everyone's property values. Tom Rodriguez admitted he'd been afraid to support me publicly because Vixen had threatened him with HOA violations against his own property. One by one, people who had been living in fear of fake authority realized that real community governance doesn't operate through intimidation and extortion. The new HOA leadership, elected after Vixen's arrest, implemented actual transparent processes, published real budgets, and focused on genuine community improvements instead of personal enrichment schemes disguised as neighborhood protection. Deputy Walsh's transformation from unwitting accomplice to community hero was honestly one of my favorite parts of this whole story. His testimony about how Vixen had weaponized legitimate law enforcement procedures became crucial evidence in federal court, and his Kendrickation led to additional charges against county officials who'd participated in the harassment campaigns. He also did something really impressive. He publicly acknowledged his mistakes and worked his ass off to rebuild trust between local police and residents who'd been victimized by abuse of authority. It takes real character to admit when you've been fooled and then work to make things right. Walsh proved that good people can get manipulated by skilled criminals, and good people can find ways to fix the damage when they understand what really happened. My personal victory turned out better than I'd ever imagined when this nightmare started. Not only did I keep grandfather's cabin and my architectural practice, but Governor Rhodes offered me a $200,000 consulting contract to help design anti-corruption protocols for county governments throughout the state. The Veteran Center project became a model for rural development, and Lana recommended my services to other state agencies working on public buildings. What started as an attack on my Lavellihood became the foundation for the most successful period of my career. Sometimes the best revenge against criminal harassment isn't just surviving, it's thriving beyond anything your attackers thought possible. The beautiful irony of Vixen's downfall was that her own greed destroyed the criminal network she'd inherited. If she'd been satisfied with smaller-scale theft, if she'd avoided targeting properties with federal implications, if she'd done basic research on her victims before launching harassment campaigns, she might have continued stealing homes for years without getting caught. But her ambition to control water rights worth millions attracted state attention, and her arrogance in confronting what she assumed was expensive legal help exposed her to federal investigation. The woman who had built her success on strategic planning and careful manipulation was ultimately destroyed by her failure to plan for opponents who were more strategic and better connected than she'd ever anticipated. 2 years later, I'm telling this story from the same desk where Governor Rhodes and I planned Vixen's takedown, looking out at the same lake view that motivated a criminal conspiracy to steal my family's legacy. Vixen served 20 years in federal prison. Her stolen assets were distributed to victims, and her name appears in criminal justice textbooks as a case study in HOA corruption. The FBI offered me a consulting job investigating white-collar crime, but I politely declined. I'm perfectly happy being an architect who happens to know the governor and has experience defeating sophisticated criminal enterprises. Sometimes the best revenge is living well in the place someone tried to steal from you, surrounded by the community they tried to turn against you, doing work that serves people instead of exploiting them. Michael was back at his peaceful desk. Governor Lana visiting for coffee and genuine friendship. An email arrives from the new HOA invitation to neighborhood movie night. He smiles, accepts readily. Camera pans to Vixen's foreclosed mansion with sold sign, then back to Michael's thriving cabin office, where justice and peace finally rule. And that's how a corrupt HOA Karen learned the hard way that underestimating people can destroy everything you've built through lies and manipulation. Sometimes justice takes time, But when it finally arrives, it's absolutely worth the wait.